really struggled with feeling like I could find spaces that held empathy for both sides. It was the first time maybe I really appreciated like the size and diversity of the American Jewish population. I found one other American Jewish girl who I really like could talk to. But other than that, I didn't feel like there was anyone else I could really relate to.
Yeah.
Because on one side, there were people who just didn't care. And on the other side, when I tried to go to Jewish spaces, they also weren't saying the things that resonate with me.
I'm Orly Erez-Likhovski. I'm the director of the Israel Religious Action Center, and I'm joined by Rabbi Weinberg, Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism for the Union for Reform Judaism and Director of IRAC. Together, we engage thinkers, leaders, educators, activists, and community builders who aren't afraid to wrestle with the tough questions of Jewish life, Israeli society, Zionism, politics, and the unfolding events that are redefining our moment. Through this podcast, we are deepening the dialogues that shape our shared future, asking what we can learn from each other's experiences in Israel and the diaspora, and what we should rightfully expect from one another. From Israel to North America, we explore how difference can strengthen community, make an impact, and how shared values can bridge even the widest gaps. Josh.
Well, in this episode of the Pluralist Podcast, we turn our attention to a generation whose voices are shaping the Jewish future in real time. 2 years after October 7th, a moment that altered the landscape of Jewish life, Israeli life, and global justice movements, we sit down with 3 young Reform Jewish social justice leaders who are currently serving in our movement, working through the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, Tamara Upfall, Daniel Block, and Blake Ziegler. These organizers are working on the ground with peers, campuses, and communities struggling to find clarity, courage, and connection in a complicated world, and we are so thrilled to have them with us. So shalom, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
And we want to start with a little bit that each of you will tell about their personal journey and identity. And we would like each of you to share with us a moment on a trip, in a class, during a conversation, or even just online when your relationship with Israel shifted in a meaningful way, and what made that moment transformative for you. We'll start with you, Tamara.
Hello, so I'm Tamara Upfall. I grew up in Rhode Island. I have a very deeply secular leftist Israeli father and a Brazilian mother, and so that was the context in which I grew up. I didn't grow up affiliated to any type of movement. I think sometimes Israelis who are secular in Israel, they come to the U.S. and they don't quite know where they belong in that landscape. And I think in some ways I was the victim of that. And I have had to find my own Jewish identity and spaces in my own way. And in terms of a moment that
That's an idea for a different podcast, too.
Shaped me. I mean, I think I grew up in a very open-minded household, I would say. Like, I remember, I think sometimes people talk about, like I was lied to or I didn't know. I felt like I really got all the information.
Mm.
Like, I remember being really young. We were flying to Israel to visit our Israeli family, and I was asking my mom, like, why is there so much extra security? She said, oh, there's a piece of land. It belongs to some people. It belongs to other people. Nothing was a mystery. I remember being in middle school, and my dad took me to see the documentary The Gatekeepers, which was like interviewing, different leaders of the Shin Bet, and it was talking about the occupation and how the occupation has created a security issue for Israel. So all to say, I've always felt like I had a very open-minded upbringing in terms of everything. And a transformative moment was in college. I was at my Hillel, and I was like the vice president for community groups, which meant that I oversaw all the Israel groups. And this new Israel group came, and they were affiliated with Zochrot, and they wanted to hold a like.
Just say a word about what Zochrot is.
Zochrot is like, it means like to remember. In the feminine, right?
Yeah.
And thank you. They wanted to hold an event honoring the Nakba around Yom Ha'atzmaut, around the same time. Like there was going to be a Hillel event, and they wanted to offer an alternative event. And I was like, okay, and it.
The Nakba is the term that Palestinians use to.
Yeah, it translates to like the catastrophe, and it's like 2 experiences that happened in that time. And I thought, okay, yeah. And that's not what happened. It was like an emergency at the Hillel. There was like a complete uprising from everyone. Everyone was very upset. Everyone was very stressed out. Like, they canceled the event, and then it was secretly held. Like, it was balagan. And I think in that moment I was like, like, why are we so afraid to like engage with this thing that we know happened, that is another side of the story, another side of this day that we're remembering? And I think that like hiding of it, to me, showed like a fear to engage with like the reality of something else that was happening. And I think for me, that was in some ways like my entry point to how messy it can be in American Jewish communities, where we avoid or we don't talk about. Yeah.
Wow. Super interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. Daniel.
Yeah. So my name is Daniel Block. I am a recent college grad. I went to Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, a historically Jewish university. Before that, I was growing up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm very much a product of the Reform Jewish movement in North America. And in fact, you asked this question about what was a transformative moment for us in relation to Israel. I have family in Shorashim in Israel. I grew up going there. I think the first time I went, I was probably 5. And, for me, Israel was always, just a place we went because I had family there. There was no other reason, it was just, we spent 3 weeks there, like hanging out with aunt, uncle, cousins, etc. When I was a child. But I didn't really, and there were always conversations in the background about what was going on in Israel, whether with family or friends or congregation, etc. Like those conversations were always in the background, but never really that obvious to me. I didn't really grasp it in the same way. I was just like, that's where the family lives, And then I think in 2018, I was on what was then called Nifty in Israel, which now Yalla Israel, which is the URJ summer programming. And I was there with my friends, and it was the same summer that the nation state law came into being. And that was happening, that same summer was when Netanyahu was meeting with Viktor Orban. And I started to realize that Israel is not just the place where my family lives. It's true. And I have friends who live there, from my growing up at summer camp. It's also a place where I need to be concerned for the sake of Jewish peoplehood and also for democracy. That when in 2018, that was in the US, that was Trump 1.0. And, we've just, for the past, my entire cognizant life, like I've just been seeing the parallels between what's been going on in the US and Israel. And that's only, so that I would say was the first transformative moment. And then when I went to Brandeis, I was involved in J Street. I was the president of J Street at Brandeis, and it was a very polarized campus on the issue of Israel. And it was so interesting, and something that I don't think you would see at many other college campuses, because the majority of the people who were on either side, if not pretty much all of them, were Jewish. And it was a very hard time to be in that leadership position. And, I think I have a very unique experience in the post-October 7th landscape as it relates to campus culture, which we can get into more later. But that's kind of the short of it all, Blake.
That's amazing, Daniel, that you had that sort of sense to connect those dots as a high school student between the nation state bill, the league in which Netanyahu plays in terms of other despotic, leaders around the world, and then, thinking about that in the broader sense. Well, kol hakavod, really.
Just, I remember this summer too, because, we've worked so hard on the nation state law, and we were so frustrated
Against it.
I think we were, and we actually were one of the, single voices who worked in the Knesset against it. I mean, I remembered me and Rabbi Gilad Kariv there in every hearing at the Knesset, and there weren't a lot of civil society organizations then, because it was sort of, we see in the last few years like a completely different picture from, on the side of the civil society. Back then, like, people, I think, didn't understand the magnitude of the law and how, damaging it is. So it's like, yeah, it's sort of stuck with me too, this memory. So, Blake, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. A little bit about me. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. I am the son of a woman who was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family, but moved our family over to the Reform movement because of the shifting demographics where we were living. All the young people were going to the Reform synagogue. And my father is a convert. He grew up Catholic, and I spent my entire life in Catholic education. So for me, a lot of my Jewish identity is about navigating literally being most of the time the only Jew in the room, particularly in interfaith spaces. I went to the University of Notre Dame, where I studied political science and philosophy, focusing like particularly on questions like that on religion and politics.
Which is a Catholic university, but yeah.
One might call it the Catholic.
Yeah, yes, of course.
And this is a tough question for me to answer in one particular episode, because 3 parts of my life come to mind. And it's funny that Daniel mentioned the nation state law, because when I was a senior in high school, that was when the law was being debated, and I was a huge competitor in high school debate. It was very much my identity as a high schooler. And we were debating topics that year pertaining to what are the qualities of a democratic country, and at what point does a democracy become an authoritarian regime? And, in addition to the strategic benefit.
Did you have a concrete answer? Was it like
studying political science.
Yes.
It's always a never-ending question or answer. And, being in that situation, and there's also the strategic components of when you're thinking of the arguments you want to make. And for me, I decided let's start to argue that Netanyahu's government is an authoritarian regime, and getting into the literature. And after growing up where, to be honest, Israel was not a huge part of my life. We would sing Hatikva at school. We would learn about it in religious school, like, oh, this is the Jewish homeland. The Holocaust happened. Now it's a state. That's where we go. You'll go there for this thing called birthright when you get older. I ended up never going on birthright. And so it never really became an important part of my life up until that moment when I actually started paying attention to the politics in Israel and learning about the nation state law. And that was when I started having this reckoning in my mind about this place that is supposed to be my homeland and that I have a spiritual connection to is not matching with my democratic values, or the values that I'm told are also Jewish values. And how can that be true? How can I hold those two things in place? Then I get into college. I start getting deep into Jewish advocacy and organizing on campus. We invite a prominent Jewish organization to come speak on the topic of anti-Zionism and its relationship to anti-Semitism. It was an awful event. It got protested, and the protesters were right to protest it because the speaker was not prepared for the tough questions. And it resulted in a lot of questions of how do you reconcile the project of Zionism under somebody like Netanyahu, or Kahanism and the Jewish supremacist aspects of it. How do you reconcile that with this project of Jewish peoplehood and democracy? Like, really core questions. And the best response the speaker could give was, well, we also criticize Israel because we say the West Bank should be open to the egalitarian section.
The West.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's been a long day.
We'd like the West Bank to be more egalitarian as well.
General.
That episode really opened up a lot of things for me about engaging people from the other side and starting to have conversations. And I think that's when I really started getting deeper into not necessarily being more critical of Israel, but trying to engage the other side more and build empathy and understanding, and really start to question, like, what is it that I know and don't know about this place that I've been told about my entire life? And then the last thing, just to wrap up, is this summer, I went to the south of Israel, kind of like right on the border with Gaza, to visit some of the sites from October 7th. And it was very harrowing and jarring that in the same breath of us remembering like the lives lost and being told about the stories of the people who died on October 7th, the Israelis, and then the people who were still being held hostage in Gaza. And then at the same time, literally just seeing across the sky Israel, like the military dropping bombs onto what looked like apartment buildings or hotels or whatever it may be, and seeing that happen, and the tour guide saying, oh, I guess they decided to drop some bombs today, and just nonchalantly talking about how, yeah, that's something that happens, knowing that people have died right before our eyes. That was a really jarring instance for me that I think created the most significant turning point in my journey regarding Israel, that this is something that if I care so deeply about it as like the homeland of the Jewish people, as an American Jew, I have to voice my concerns about it towards those things.
Well, thank you for sharing all your stories. I'm definitely resonated with many of them, but you mentioned Blake October 7th, and I really want to ask you because obviously it was sort of a watershed moment for all of us, really for Jews all over the world, and I wanted to ask, how did you experience it, and how this affected you and specifically your relationship with Israel, and how does it feel today? 2 years after October 7th. I mean, I can tell you that we in Israel have gone through a very deep and long process of, mourning and trauma, which we're still recovering from. But it did, sort of put into question a lot of things for us. And I'm wondering, how is it from sort of your side? So shall we start now, maybe with Daniel?
October 7th, 2023. So that week, it was Sukkot, John Sukkot, and at Brandeis, as part of the Brandeis Reform Chavran, we had invited Rabbi Mike Moskowitz from Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, who, great thinker on all things like LGBT, whether Israel, America, Judaism, and it was just such a beautiful moment where the entire
Might be worth mentioning that he comes from the ultra-Orthodox world, and is working at an LGBTQ Synod congregation, and he is a fascinating character, right? So he came to visit as a scholar, as a speaker, as a speaker. Yeah.
And it was just this beautiful moment. We had, it wasn't just the Reform group who came, in full force, but the conservative group, the Orthodox group, everyone was there, and it was a really lovely community event. And then several days later, it was, I believe, a Saturday, and I started getting text messages and news alerts about an attack in Israel. And, my first reaction is, okay, that's not so crazy. I remember growing up worrying about, there always being an attack or, some bombings for a week or two. And so I wasn't anticipating when I started hearing the news of just the incredible horror of October 7th. And I think at Brandeis specifically, because it is such a historically Jewish university with a namesake is father of American Zionism, Louis Brandeis, first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, and immediately within the next week or two, it felt like the entire Jewish community, it was very tense. You could cut the tension with a knife, and it just felt like the slightest thing could set someone off. And there were, I mentioned I was involved in Jewish community at Brandeis and J Street, and it was incredibly difficult to operate in those spaces, especially for those of us in the Reform group, but also other groups who kind of wanted to do something about the attack on October 7th and remember the lives lost and, kind of process the trauma. And at the same time, as the war was really starting to ramp up and when the invasion of Gaza started, also mourning those lives at the same time. And we had such incredible difficulty getting the entire Jewish community at Brandeis around that. There were people who were saying, oh, you're Israeli apologists, you're excusing what is, this is still November, December 2023, but, you still had saying, you're excusing a genocide, or ethnic cleansing. And then you had people on the other side, saying, why are you doing this? Why should we care about Palestinians? There's not a good one in the lot, and it was incredibly difficult.
And we have no room for empathy or
exactly. Just this drive for revenge, it felt like. And it was incredibly difficult to navigate that and try and maintain community even outside of the Israel conversation in the wake of October 7th. I think eventually, I went abroad, didn't in 2024, so I wasn't on campus for that. But I think in when I returned in the fall of 2024, things had calmed down a bit, I think, a lot. And I think the university did a pretty good job of facilitating conversations. Right after October 7th, they'd canceled classes for the day to do teach-ins about how to have these difficult conversations. And I do think that's part of the reason why, compared to other universities, I mean, also Brandeis demographically is different, but we didn't have the same trauma, we'll say. But I think by the time I returned from study abroad, it was much calmer, and it's still tense at times. But that's kind of my initial reaction to and memory of October 7th.
Yeah, thank you for that. I completely understand. So you got caught in the middle, sort of between those two, extreme sides, and I can tell you that, like, for me and for like many Israelis, right after October 7th, I think we were so engulfed in pain that like, even for me, it was really hard to see the pain of the other side. Like, I'm ashamed to say that, but like for a few weeks, like I was like in a complete shock. And then like for me, it took a few weeks, but unfortunately for many Israelis, it took months and months until they could actually see the other side and see, that the pain, if at all, and yeah, and like that, to understand that one pain does not negate the other, and they should really acknowledge both of them. And some have not up until now. Tamara, how about you?
Yeah, so I want to say, so what percent Jewish was Brandeis, would you say?
I believe the official number is 33%. Like that's what Hillel says. I would guess that it is actually much higher. Because I don't really know how they collect that data. It might just be Hillel attendance, but it is, you throw a stone, you hit 5 Jewish kids from New Jersey. So yeah.
Probably don't throw a stone.
Don't.
Try to avoid that. Yeah. Yes.
Well, when October 7th happened, I was on campus, but like a very different campus. I was at Oxford in the UK, which is like 2 to 5 maybe % Jewish. Like, just as an American, to be in a space with so few Jews was on its own crazy. And I think I'd never considered what that actually felt like. And I remember when October 7th happened, right? Our time, like the time zone we're in is closer to Israel.
Yeah.
So it was happening like more in real time. And I remember people kept saying like, are you okay? And I was like, no, like there's a war, like there's going to be a war. And people were like, what, where, like there was such a disconnect.
Yeah.
And I think it was like a full few days where I felt like disconnected from everyone around me because I was just watching what was happening, like in shock. And it seemed like no one else knew it was something they had to follow yet.
This feeling of loneliness, right?
Yeah. And I, very much to what you were saying, really struggled with feeling like I could find spaces that held empathy for both sides. And I think it was the first time maybe I really appreciated like the size and diversity of the American Jewish population, because I couldn't find I found one other American Jewish girl who I really could talk to. But other than that, I didn't feel like there was anyone else I could really relate to.
Yeah.
Because on one side, there were people who just didn't care. And on the other side, when I tried to go to Jewish spaces, they also weren't saying the things that resonate with me. I didn't feel like wrapping an Israeli flag around me and singing Hatifa. I wanted to mourn what was happening. And I even remember one day I was crying and I went to my thesis advisor and she was like, what happened? And I was like, I'm feeling a lot of pain for both sides right now. Because I think something else that was interesting was I was one of very few Jews. And I was also one of the only person in my program who actually knew Palestinians who were impacted or who had died. Either through a friend or I'd Zoomed with them before in coexistence work. And so I actually knew people, and I knew people who were taken hostage, and I was so in the middle of it. And I remember I came to her crying and she said, there are no two sides. There's the Palestinian people and Israel is a terrorist state. And I didn't know what to do with that. And I felt...
And that was right after October 7th?
Yeah. Maybe a month or so after. And I just
do you want to share what you were studying there? What program?
I was studying refugee studies. So
okay.
It's everything. I mean, you can't talk about Israel without talking about the notion of refugees and the history of refugees, of the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. And I mean, there's so much there. And so also it was I was processing this shocking event in my lifetime and going to class every day.
Wow.
And learning about it and learning theories about it. We were reading Frantz Fanon, who says, I think it's justice only comes from the rotting corpse of the settler. Really intense language.
It's based on the Algerian story, right? And
exactly, with the French. So...
Yeah, I think what we really hear is, and I think what is lacking often from the discourse about Israel is a lack of nuance and lack of complexities. And reality is super complex. And it's not as simple as people try to, present. And I think that's really what stands at the root of the matter since October 7th and up until now, right? And I think this is what we're struggling to show, right? There are a lot of complexities, there are a lot of opinions, there are a lot of, points of view, and we should really think about all of those and not try to show it in a simplistic way.
Yeah, and I think also that, what I hear from each of you is that when we're faced with a time of crisis, people tend to, flock to what they perceive to be a safe space.
And I just want to say, in that time of struggling with the nuance, I think what really helped me was I found groups like Standing Together. And finally, I felt like I was hearing like the voices and the nuance that I needed.
First of all, this is really impressive how each of you are reflecting on this and also expressing these feelings that are not easy. And I want to press on that, actually. And I want to get into it more a little bit. So, how's the conversation among your peers? How among the people you grew up with, or people you went to high school or college with, and now you're working as professionals, and obviously very publicly associated with like a mainstream Jewish organization. Some might say establishment. Okay, we've been called worse. And we have a very wide ideological or political spectrum within the reform movement. Where does this sit with you right now? How I'm thinking both like the intra-Jewish conversation that you're having either with your peers or with others, and then also, as part of your work, how do you show up with partner organizations? So I'll just say, for many of us, there was a sort of like a double whammy, actually, in that, one, the actual attack and massacre that occurred on October 7th, and then in the days and weeks after, when some people we thought were our friends and allies and partners, and it turns out we're not at all. And that was also really hard, and with my rabbinical colleagues, we talk about that a lot, in terms of where. So, how is this playing out for you in your own sort of personal and professional lives, if you're willing to share?
Yeah. Do you mean Jewish peers, non-Jewish peers, or just in general?
Both.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Because I have many.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course.
I think for me, and what I've found when I've talked to other Jews, is mine is kind of like an exception to the rule, and that I didn't have the experience that many Jews had, where it's like, oh, my non-Jewish friends, they're not friends with me anymore. Like they're posting on Instagram, like Israel is a genocidal state, or like even like within the Jewish community, like the tension and everything. I didn't really experience that as much, and I think part of it was because at the time that October 7th happened, I had taken a step away from the Jewish advocacy organizing space, and I had been pursuing like teaching high school and being a debate director and enjoying that life. And so I just wasn't plugged into those spaces as much. But with my college friends, because October 7th for me was just a few months after I graduated college. So a lot of them did post things like that. But what I found was they were much more willing to be open to conversation than the stories that I was hearing from Jewish peers. And that was something I really appreciated, was the opportunity to have deep dialogue with people that I either deeply disagreed with, or I felt like we agreed, but perhaps we were using the wrong language. And the learning that I took from most of those conversations was it's not necessarily a difference of opinion, but a difference of definition. For example, a lot of my college friends that I would have conversations with, and they would be posting about Israel is a terrorist state. There's an ethnic cleansing happening in Palestine, and like a very black and white picture of it, and not recognizing that there's also a terrorist group in Gaza that has killed a bunch of Israelis and wants to annihilate the Jewish people, and that there is a legitimate threat. And to an extent, there is a justified response or need to take out that threat, of course, in a humanitarian way. And so when I would talk to them, many of them would ask me, do you still identify as a Zionist? And I would say, yes. And they would ask me, how could you do that? And they would point to like all of these like liberal democratic things that I said that I like aspire to live out, or like that I did in college, or that I affiliated myself with. And it was often a conversation about what do you mean by the term Zionism? And I found that for many people, especially in the non-Jewish world, when they think Zionism, they're really thinking Kahanism, Jewish self-supremacy, that we need to consolidate the Jewish state, like the Jewish nation state law is an example of that. And so that's the immediate reaction.
Yeah. What you're saying is sort of reminding me that, during the 2023 democracy protest, we sort of reclaimed, the Israeli flag, and we are now talking about reclaiming Jewish values as, further of the way than what the government is presenting. So essentially you're talking about, reclaiming Zionism, right? It's not the Zionism that the Israeli government is presenting, but rather the version that we believe in, right? Liberal Zionism that is aligned with, Reformed Jewish values. So it's really the same.
Yeah, and even I hear that a lot, that people sort of conflate the current administration or the current coalition with the concept of Zionism, or as a movement. And I often compare it to the United States, in which one can be a proud American even if they don't necessarily ally with the current administration, as it were, which I'm. Most of the people in my circle do not. But it sounds fascinating, Blake, that people were. First of all, I think that's the most important question you can ask is, well, what do you mean by that? Help me. And that you found people who were curious and interested in engaging. And did you find that people were looking to you because you were Jewish, as hey, can you break this down? Can you explain it to us? Can you?
For the most part, yes. But I think it was because for most people, I was either the only Jew that they knew, or for the ones that I was in college with, I was the Jew on campus.
Yeah.
As in I was the one pushing for all of the interfaith kind of stuff. But I think.
And is that the same feeling now that you live in New York? Yeah.
Quite the same.
I'm very glad to blend into the crowd.
Yeah.
But I think a similar thing can be said about, I want to say our side of the aisle, but also recognizing people might disagree with me, in the sense that, it's very easy for us on the side that is critical of the Israeli government, or critical of kind of this Kahanism that's been emerging over the last few decades, and hide behind it by saying, oh, we defend a liberal conception of Zionism, belief in democracy, and even support for the two-state solution, and all of these things, equality and everything. But I find that there's not enough nuance on that side about what actually that looks like and what work is necessary to accomplish that, which is why groups like Standing Together also resonate with me, like Tamara said. I just wanted to point that out, that it's not just on the other side that's having this issue of nuance, but also on our own side.
Daniel, do you want to share too?
Yeah, I think when I have these conversations, and I think I want to speak more to the intra conversations, with other Jewish people my age. I think a lot of people are kind of what Blake was alluding to, uncomfortable with the term Zionism and identifying as a Zionist. And I think part of that is because of the conflation with Kahanism and Netanyahu's government. I think something to really remember here is people our age do not know an Israel separate from Netanyahu. We do not know the Israel of the 90s, or what could have been the Israel post the 90s.
He was prime minister for 3 years in the 90s also. Remember? So yeah. No, it makes your point even more. Yeah.
And the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in Israel. That is all we know. And so I think that is how people my generation, I think if you're not really entrenched in this work, like the three of us are, it is hard not to view Zionism as, being inherently intertwined with the Netanyahu agenda. And what I push back on, and what I say is Zionism, base level, is a belief that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in the land of Israel. And, when someone says, okay, well, what about Palestinians? I say, well, I believe Zionism is a liberal cause. It is liberal in the sense that it liberated us from oppression in Europe and across the world. And Israel is a place where we can go and be a majority and have influence over our own lives. But to accept that and not to accept, that same self-determination for Palestinians, I think that's where we run into trouble. And I think it's important that we say we are Zionism, and our Zionism does not only allow, but demands self-determination for people, for groups of people. And so it's not logically consistent to me. And that's what I always point out to people. If you are for one side and not for the other, it doesn't make any sense to me. And I feel like by pointing that out, especially with my non-Jewish friends, it opens some doors of imagining new conceptions of Israel. So that's what I would like to add there.
Yeah, fair. So I spend a lot of time in rooms where, let's say, I'm 47, and I spend a lot of time in places where I'm the youngest person in the room. And the conversation, more often than not, goes to the place of, well, what about the young people? And, are they going to abandon Israel? And they don't have the, sort of inherent memory of the Holocaust, of the establishment of the State of Israel, of even the 6-Day War. And as I think you really put very well in terms of, the reality that of Israel has been Netanyahu as prime minister, with an increasing, Netanyahu for many years brought someone to his left to be part of the coalition, whether it was Ehud Barak or Ehud Olmert or Benny Gantz or whatever. And in the last 3 years, we know he's taken a sharp turn to the right in terms of the ultra-Orthodox and the ultra-nationalist camp in Israel, and has entrenched that, and that is glaring, from across the pond here. But talk to me a little bit about the generational gap. How has this conversation gone for you, whether it's with people in your life who are educational role models or professors or even parents, grandparents, family members, people in your workspace. I think this is the big question. The question I get most when I visit congregations is parents anywhere from age 50 on up saying, I don't know how to talk to my kids about this. About Israel, about these, big questions. How has that played out for you? And what advice might you give them to how to talk to their kids about it? If we can put you on the spot for that. Yeah.
I mean, I think a big part of it is acknowledging, right, what Daniel said, that for the majority of our lives, we have seen a Netanyahu Israel. We have watched a government continue to do more and more things to make Israel farther and farther away from a democratic state, less and less equal in so many ways, as a woman, as someone who works in the reform movement. Like, none of these identities are at all respected or valued in Israel under Netanyahu's government. And so I think a lot has to do with acknowledging the reality, I think as much as we avoid it and shun people for speaking out based on what they've seen, that's where I think a lot of the resentment comes from. I've had, I'm going to make a comparison. I think oftentimes as someone who comes from someone with, an Israeli family and a more secular leftist Israeli family, my cousins have left Israel and they've moved to the U.S. My aunt and uncle are seeking citizenship in Portugal. They are actively choosing to leave Israel because they don't want their kids to fight in wars that they see as unjustified. They don't see a future for themselves there anymore. And so these are real facts that I see. And I've witnessed sometimes that when I present my lived experience to other people, they become very defensive or they try to negate it.
It was such a pleasure to host Tamara, Daniel, and Blake for this eye-opening conversation about what young Reform Jews think about Israel, how they can relate to Israel at a very, very difficult and challenging time. We are now recording after the last hostage has been returned this week, Rani Gvili, and finally there are no hostages in Gaza. It means that we are about to move to a different stage, which is sort of a closure of sort, but also so many challenges ahead. We know how much work we have on our hands to fix Israeli society and to heal so many wounds and pains that have endured. And I think in this process the voice of the next generation is super important. And we were so lucky to be able to talk with this thoughtful and engaging young leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. At this pivotal moment, I think, in our lives and really the history of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, sometimes it's important to step back and realize that some people even struggle to have a conversation like this. And, Orly, I was thinking about this a lot, that you and I spend a lot of our time and a lot of our job is to talk and to explain and to give lectures and to present Israel. And this, I think, was an opportunity for us just to sit and really listen and internalize. And my hope is that we can model this for so many people. And by the way, it's not that we're that much older than, than
Of course,
but,
we're young.
but
We're young in spirit.
but we are in a different generation, and we see things differently in terms of, the fact that, they really only have known one prime minister in Israel, and that really makes an impact on how they see the world and their perspective. So I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity, and of course, this is not the last time that we'll engage this demographic and hear from their perspectives. And it's important to remember that their perspectives and their own perspectives, that we're not asking them to speak for, an entire population or an entire demographic, but really for themselves.
For sure. And I think really connection between young Reformed Jews in North America and young Reformed Jews in Israel is a bridge that could really help strengthen the relationship between Israel and diaspora. So I think it's really just the beginning of an important discussion that we should continue. If you who listened or watched this episode care about thoughtful, honest conversations like the one that we just had, please subscribe to our podcast, to the Pluralist Podcast. Please share this episode and invite others to listen with you because we believe in the importance of these conversations.
Absolutely.
See you in our next
So
episode.